Oh look, a hornet's nest. I haven't face planted in one of those for a while, so in the immortal words of Bionic Dance, let's do this.
I think it's time to discuss your philosophy of drug use as it relates to artistic endeavor.
A long time ago, when dinosaurs ruled the earth and my beard wasn't grey, there was an atheist community on YouTube. And this was a wide, broad, diverse church, joke intended, that took in a lot of different people with a lot of different viewpoints. And then there was a schism, a cataclysm between the new atheists and the skeptical atheists and the political atheists, atheism plus, people who were atheistic primarily due to political concerns, people who aligned themselves more with humanism and, you know the story from everywhere else, social justice. So there was a distinct split between people who were skeptical because they were skeptical and sought to examine everything, not just religious claims, through the lens of skepticism, and those who were atheists because they saw that as a way to stand up against the man or whatever. Their primary concern was that they didn't want religion interfering with people. That was a unified concern from both halves. But they weren't rooted in skepticism and scientific inquiry and so on in the way that the others were. This was ruinous. This took a huge amount of impetus out of the atheist movement as everyone fell into infighting and so on, and it was a terrible mistake on the part of all involved, but most particularly those of Atheism Plus, who were willing to give up their skepticism for the sake of political expediency. Now people pretty much divided up into their camps, and never the twain shall meet ever since, but there has been a crop of new atheistic commentators turning up on YouTube, supplanting many of the old ones and driving the conversation, covering a lot of the same old ground but with fresh sets of eyes and so on. And just recently we've seen that exact same schism start to open up, not with the same degree of vociferousness and nastiness as we've seen before, but it's still not particularly pleasant. What was the Flashpoint this time around? Previously, last week, on Atheism on the Internet, last time with the Atheism Plus split, it was primarily over feminism and some of the more outlandish claims of feminism, some of the counter-scientific claims of some forms of feminism, and things like Elevator Gate. Someone asked someone else for coffee in an elevator, and this was the end of the world, apparently. This time, it's a bit more thorny than that, and it's trans issues. So there are two of these newer, slightly, atheist commentators on YouTube who've gathered some measure of success. And in the skeptical corner, we have Rationality Rules. And in the Sock Just corner, we have Essence of Thought. Now, I'm subscribed to both of these people. I have to say I prefer Rationality Rules, mostly because of his delivery. Essence of Thought has this very monotonous, rather dull, condescending sounding mode of delivery. I recognise that that's just the way that they talk and so on, but it does make it harder to listen to them, which is unfortunate. Now, Rationality Rules examined a topic that several other people in the kind of skeptosphere have examined, that being trans people in sport and whether there are unfair advantages and so on. I mean, you can see the visceral reaction that some people have to this if you watch Joe Rogan or listen to Joe Rogan at all. Yeah, he is quite often outraged, and a lot of his guests are outraged when trans women are beating on cis women in MMA matches, because he perceives that as unfair. It's a kind of visceral gut reaction that a lot of people have, and it's also a culturally inculcated reaction that when you see a man beating on a woman, you react with disgust, you want to intervene, you want to put an end to it or whatever. And people's programming, if you will, is not keeping up with the social change that is going on around trans people. And the question is whether this is fair. Having gone through a male puberty, is your muscle mass greater? Are you taller? Do you have greater reach? Do you have greater oxygen efficiency? Do you have higher testosterone even after HRT and transition that can make you more aggressive, more powerful, all of these things? And this is also a concern in other sports. We have, I think they're an intersex athlete under a lot of scrutiny and testing. Does she have an unfair advantage? Do trans women or trans men have unfair advantages in particular sports? And so on. It's a gigantic mess. Now, Rationality Rules put out a video about this, some of which was off base, a lot of which wasn't, really just kind of discussing the issue in a fairly detached manner, to which Essence of Thought reacted poorly. Now, I think we can understand an emotional reaction, since Essence of Thought is apparently trans. I didn't actually know that until fairly recently. I just thought they were an ally. You can understand when someone feels that their identity or their sexuality or whatever else is under attack, why they would react with emotion. A lot of people think that I advocate for a completely emotionless state when looking into these kind of things. That's not it. Emotions are important, they just don't affect what's real. So while we should acknowledge people's emotions, facts always have to come first, I think. People also misunderstand my position on trans issues because I have in the past called myself a biological realist. That doesn't mean I'm denying that transgender people exist. It's just acknowledging that there are differences between the sexes. God, the language is so confused around all this. Gender used to be, and still is in a lot of contexts, synonymous with sex, but we're now taking gender to mean gender presentation and sex to mean biological gender, but we talk about sex change operations even though you can't yet change your sex. I know it sounds tired, but I have trans friends. They seem to understand where I'm coming from, in that I feel for you, I recognise your condition, I believe that you should be treated as you wish to be treated by society in so much as it's possible to do so, because there are the biological differences, but the fact still remains that your sex cannot be altered, only your gender presentation. They seem to understand and accept that nuanced position. It only seems to be people on the internet who seem to think that's a transphobic position, but let's not get too far off the point. Anyway, accusations have flown, debunkings, rebunkings, and de-debunkings have gone off on all sides. Noel Plum, well worth a subscription, has done a really long video really kind of delving into the science and the papers. It's incredibly dry and incredibly long, but it's well worth a listen if you want to be informed on what the science says. And plenty of other people have references to papers and so on. I don't actually want to get into that argument. This is all preamble, as is fairly usual on this channel. I want to take a step back and look at this from a kind of meta level, because we're running into exactly the same problem that we always did before, that we always seem to run into whenever we get into these kinds of discussions with the socially justice animated. Now, when I say social justice, I don't actually mean the equality, I mean the kind of woke activism that goes too far, that often distorts science or misrepresents science to pursue what they see as an ideologically worthwhile goal, which it might well be, but I think reality always has to trump. But the point that I want to get at is that we need to be able to have these conversations, and I think the only reason that this hasn't become as bad a schism as during the Atheism Plus days is because Rationality Rules has shown an incredible amount of forbearance, of patience, of humility in the face of the criticism, has perhaps apologised where he really shouldn't have to or didn't ought to have to. Yeah, that's the only reason this hasn't gotten worse, because the reaction to him even attempting to discuss these issues has been gratuitous and wrong-headed, and accused him of being alt-right and all the usual stuff that you expect. I don't see him as being transphobic. I don't see him as being anything of these things that he's accused of being. He's just trying to get at the truth. And how do you get at the truth in these things? You perform non-biased studies, you examine the data, you have the arguments and the discussion. But you have to be able to have the arguments and the discussion in order to resolve things and find out the truth, whatever that might be. But if you react to anyone even attempting to discuss these issues by accusing them of bigotry and hatred and anti-trans prejudice and whatever else, then you can't really have the discussion. And the only reason we're still having the discussion on this at the moment is because Rationality Rules hasn't reacted with the same level of emotion and anger and resentment, which he would be fully justified in doing, quite frankly, even though he's been accused of all these things. That's the only reason it hasn't been worse than it has, and why we are getting some semblance of a discussion about this. And that's how it should be, but that's how it should be from both sides. You shouldn't be hurling accusations, you should be looking at the evidence, you should be honing your arguments, making those arguments, having those discussions. I mean, as we saw before, if you, the progressive person, are not making the arguments, if you don't have the data and the science on your side, if you resort to silencing and deplatforming and reporting and accusing and all of these other things, you lose the argument. Because while you're unwilling to have the argument, while you're unwilling to platform views you disagree with and so on, the people who are genuinely against you and aren't just having a free inquiry into this, trying to discern the truth, the people who are against you are more than happy to have the conversation, and their arguments are honed, and they are willing to talk to people, and they will browbeat them with their point of view. And so without you pulling in the other direction and providing the counter, the debunking and so on, then there's an inevitable gravity in the opposite direction. Now, the Skeptosphere was never far right, never right wing, but because they were willing to have the conversations, the far right and so on stepped into that space and had the conversations that the activist types weren't willing to have. And so there was a natural gravity and a slight pull to the right. I still don't think that the Skeptosphere is right wing or deserves the skeptic TM sort of derogatory comments and so on that it gets. But you can't deplatform, censor, report, accuse, harass, and refuse to have arguments with people and still expect them to somehow end up on your side. You have to make the argument. And it's perfectly understandable why horrible people being willing to have the conversations will still manage to persuade some people or move the needle in their direction. So I would implore everyone involved to stay polite, to not take free inquiry as a personal insult or an attack on your being, to recognise that there is nuance and that there probably are issues here that will need to be resolved one way or the other, because very few things in this world are completely black or completely white. So have the conversation, and this appeal particularly goes to the social justice-y, activist-y side of things, who mostly won't ever watch one of my videos, I'm sure, but you need to have the conversation. Not the arrogant dismissal, not the accusations, not the deplatforming, not the censorship, not any of that. You need to have the conversation. You need to present your points, and they need to be well made, factually backed, and you especially need to watch out for activist pseudoscience. Zang.